Copyright in these lectures is either owned by the ANU or a third party who has licensed the ANU to use it. Students may use the recording for personal study only. No lecture may be communicated online, copied or shared without the prior permission of the ANU.
Welcome, everyone. There you go. Welcome, everyone, to the first lecture for Econ 8069, Business Economics. My name is James Taylor, and I'll be your lecturer for this course. I'm a lecturer here at ANU at the Research School of Economics. My interests mostly lie in microeconomics. I actually go in sort of hard micro theory, way down deep into decision theory and those sorts of things. But for this course, we're going to be doing a bit of microeconomics for the first couple of weeks, first 6 weeks. We're doing some macroeconomics for the second 6 weeks. It should be a nice, fun course. We should be covering lots of material, though not too much material today. But it should be nice, clean, fun course. Who here is doing a finance degree of some sort? Lots. Who's doing accounting? Business or MBAs? Group down the front. Anyone doing an economics degree? If you're doing an economics degree, you have to see me at the end. If you're doing a degree with the School of Economics, you must see me at the end of this lecture because you can't do this course. Right? If you're doing a degree in economics, you cannot do this course. This course is a service course, which means it's a course in economics, but it's for all of our friends in finance and accounting and business. That's what this course is designed for. Because it is only a single course, but it covers both micro and macro, and so it's really designed as a one-shop introduction to economics. And that's what the purpose of this course is because when you go out and you do finance and you do accounting and you do business, it's useful to have at least a little bit of economics knowledge. And this course is to give you that little bit of economics knowledge. Okay, that's my weird spiel at the start, and now we'll actually get stuck into the actual material for the day. As always, deeply unfortunately, we have to start with the administration for the course. This will go through pretty quickly. Lectures, you're all aware at this point, are in this room at this time on this day, so that's pretty straightforward. For tutorial sign-up has been pretty good so far, so hopefully so it seems like everyone's pretty aware of what's going on here. For tutorials, you're expected to attend one tutorial each week, and not more than that. You have to enroll in a tutorial on Wattle. Oh dear. You have to enroll in a tutorial on Wattle. Currently, the tutorials on Wattle are basically all pretty much full. Additional slots will open up at 12:30 today. So if you log back in at 12:30 today, there'll be if you're not currently enrolled in the tutorial, or you're enrolled in the tutorial but don't really like your current time, you should log back into Wattle at 12:30 today, when there'll be additional slots, and hopefully an additional tutorial as well, opening at that time. Wattle, hopefully you've all seen Wattle, you've all found Wattle. This is the Wattle page. Everything for the course will be on the Wattle page. You get the lecture recordings. This is not quite for students, but that's right. You get the lecture recordings. You'll have the lecture slides for each week will go up. Ideally, they'll go up on usually the Monday of that week. So, three things where we help you are the lectures every week, the tutorials every week, and the help desk every week starting in week 2. Tutorials start next week. The help desk also starts next week. The help desk is the tutor sits in a room and gives one-on-one tutoring. Right? If you're struggling or if you want to push forward and really master some topic, this is the place to go. You've been to tutorial, you kind of understood, but really just want to clarify something, or you went to tutorial and it just went totally over your head and you have no idea what's happening. The help desk and office hours are the place to go to. A tutor sits in a room, gives one-on-one tutoring. In the similar vein, there's also my office hours on Thursday afternoons, where I sit in a room and give one-on-one tutoring. The times and locations for these are available on Wattle immediately, but basically it's Wednesday and Thursday afternoons. There'll be a lot of time open on those 2 days. There'll be 6 hours of help desk in total, 4 hours of tutorial, 4 hours from the tutors and 2 hours from me every week that you can go to for additional assistance. Again, this is on 2 different levels. This is both if you're really struggling and really need help desperately, and also if you feel like you kind of know the stuff, but you just want that little bit of extra help. This is good for both of those kinds of things. The textbook, I want to be clear about the textbook. The textbook is this text here. This is Economics by Acemoglu. This is the textbook that you want. That word yes there does not appear at all. This is the textbook that you want. Right? Economics by Acemoglu. Looks like this. It's available not from the co-op, because there isn't a co-op anymore, but it's available from the bookstore on campus. The text you do not want, that looks very similar and is immediately adjacent to it in the bookstore, is this one. Do not buy this one. It will not assist, well, it will assist you. It'll be great for the first 6 weeks and be useless for the second 6 weeks. Because again, this course does 6 weeks of microeconomics and then 6 weeks of macroeconomics. If you buy the text called Microeconomics, you'll have a great textbook for the first 6 weeks, and you won't have one for the second 6 weeks. So make sure you buy Economics. Economics. The breakdown is purely because if you're only doing a microeconomics course, then you buy the microeconomics text. The chapters in economics, the first, 15 odd chapters in economics are the same as the first chapters in microeconomics. This just has more. Yes. Yes, sorry. Yes, absolutely. So old edition, so this is the second edition, this is the second international edition that I showed you here. Previous editions, totally fine. US, Canada editions, totally fine. It's completely fine. There are obviously differences between the first and second edition. If you don't get the second edition and second international edition, and I give page references, the page references will be wrong, obviously, compared to first edition, but that's the only difference. It won't make a difference. I'm very happy for past editions, etc., of course. Otherwise, any questions at this? Well, yeah, I'll get to the end and then I'll see about questions. I've said this before already. The course, we do 6 weeks of micro, then an exam, then 6 weeks of macro. The assessment for the course that people always get a bit antsy about, so there's going to be, I guess, 4 main assessment components. There's a mid-semester exam, a final exam, problem sets, and a personal project. The problem sets are going to be worth 7.5% each. They're relatively small objects. This is just in week 4 or so, I'll give you a problem set. You have to produce written solutions and submit them during week 5. And then these are handed back during week 6. And again, they're tutorial style problems. They'll be relatively small problems. These are things that shouldn't concern you too much. You have to do it, right? But it's really just to make sure that you know what's happening before the exam. You've tried problems. You've actually sat down and really worked through problems before the exam. And similarly for problem set 2, but in the second semester. The only piece of assessment that covers the entire semester will be the personal project. So I'll talk more about this in the coming weeks, but basically this is you pick a topic that you think is interesting for you to write about and is related to economics, and you write about it. It really is a personal project. And again, I'll give more details on this later, but basically, this is, as I say, this is during week 11, and this is you write a 3 or 4 page report on a thing that you find interesting. because I want to make this as broad as possible, because it has to have economic impact, but I'm very happy for people to talk about things in finance or things in accounting or things not in those, in things that are strictly economics or things that are sociology but with an economic bent or psychology with an economic bent. All these things are fine, but again, I'll talk more about this in the coming weeks. The big distinction, again, between this course and most other courses, because we have this clear break between the first half and the second half of the course, the final exam and the mid-semester exam are worth the same amount. They're both worth 35%. The final exam and the mid-semester exam only assess the material from their respective terms, from their respective teaching periods. So the mid-semester exam, which I'm desperately hoping will be in week 7, but I can't tell you because I don't know. I'm desperately hoping will be in week 7, will only be on the material from the microeconomics half of the course. The final exam will only be on material from the macroeconomics half of the course. Some minor exceptions, things that are microeconomics but we use in the macroeconomics half, for example, potentially. But generally speaking, the final exam only covers the second half of the course, which is very different than what you will have in most of your courses. Okay, that's the admin for the course. The course outline is available on Wattle. If you just head to, it was a bit horrible setup, but I've fixed it. So if you just head to course outline, you'll be able to get to the course outline or class summary for the course. All the information that you might possibly want is here. Please do have a look over this material. Questions, concerns at this time?
Just 2 points, James, for the finals and for the course outline. I noticed that for the course outline, I suggested to please correlate the summary of activities with respective chapters. And for the
chapters in the textbook? I can do that. I'll be doing that during the semester, but certainly not. I can't change the course outline. The course outline is now fixed, but I can certainly talk about which chapters are being covered each week. That's fine.
For the final exam, especially for full-time students?
There is nothing I can do in terms of when the exams are set.
So are we able to maybe individually just request for a deferral just to...
Not based on work. You can request, you can request a deferral of exams, but exam timing and deferral for exams, this is a university-wide thing, are not done by the lecturer at all. I have absolutely no say and no power whatsoever on when exams are held, on whether you get deferrals for exams. It's just out of my hands. It's something that's run by the college. Typically, you would be able to get a deferred exam on the basis of illness. You would not be able to get a deferred exam on the basis of I work full-time. It's not something for which deferred exams are offered. Mental health will be something that you could get a deferral on. Yes, absolutely. But I have work that day is not going to be has never in my experience been sufficient. Otherwise, questions, concerns, problems. Lovely. So quickly for expectations for the course. No? Yes. Sorry. The question was, if you miss a tutorial, can you just attend a different tutorial, basically? I encourage you not to miss a tutorial. The answer is yes, but don't do it, I guess. As in, yes, but please don't abuse it, because otherwise you end up with, 1,000 people in the Friday at 12 o'clock tutorial or whatever it is. If it's a one-off thing and you really have to, you're sick on Monday, because no tutes Monday, you're sick on Tuesday, yes, you can go to a tute on Thursday. But again, this is not something I want people to be abusing, because we have limitations in terms of the size of rooms and number of people in each tutorial. Otherwise, I feel like I missed someone. That's why everyone laughed. No? Questions? Cool. Quick notes on expectations for the course, because it's not necessarily clear, and certainly it's different between different universities, and most of you will be new to ANU here. So the minimum expectations, which are not the recommended pattern of study, but the minimum expectations for the course are that you look over the lecture slides prior to the lecture. Right? You should have looked over these things already. And certainly in future weeks, it's expected that you will have had at least a quick look through the lecture slides. You're expected to attend lecture. You're expected to look at the tutorial problems prior to when you go into the tutorial, right, to have thought about them. expected to attend tutorials, you're expected to more than just attend tutorials. As a minimum expectation, you're expected to participate in tutorials. That is to say, tutorials are not lectures. Tutorials are not the tutor stands up the front and divulges information onto you. The tutorials are the tutor stands up the front and guides the work, guides the discussion on the material in order to get to, correct solutions, I guess. But so you're expected to participate in tutorials. You're expected to go to the help desk or office hours if you're ever unsure about stuff or if you ever want to master things. You're expected, and this one's the one that I've been told I should really emphasize, is you're expected to do an average of 5 hours per week, as a minimum, 5 hours per week, of private study time. So that is to say, in addition to the 2 hours of lecture, in addition to the 1 hour of tute, you're expected to do 5 additional hours on your own. And I'm told that this is different in different places, but certainly at ANU, there's the expectation of there's 3 hours when you are with us, and there's at least 5 and usually more when you're working on your own on stuff, or on your own or in study groups, or separately to when you're with us, when you're with the people running the course, lecturers and tutors. As a recommendation, I really would go, I don't want to go too much further than that, because that is most of the stuff you should be doing, but really the key changes that I would want everyone to do, but I don't really expect everyone to do, but that I'd really recommend is, if you're in lecture and you don't know what's happening, you should put your hand up. The huge majority of the time, if you're in lecture and you're not sure what's happening, it's because I've skipped something, or I've said something wrong, or I've put something wrong on the board. Right? That is usually what's occurred there. And so when that's the case, please do, you're not the only person sitting there going, what the hell is happening? Everyone is sitting there going, what the hell has James just done? And so if you're the one that puts your hand up and goes, James, what the hell have you just done? That's really helpful to me, it's really helpful to you, and it's really helpful to everyone in the room. So if you're not sure in lecture, please do ask questions. It helps everyone. I strongly encourage you to, in addition to form study groups, it's going to save you a huge amount of time and a huge amount of effort. It's going to make everything much easier if you form into study groups. Now, I'll talk about this more later, but certainly for problem sets and for exams and for personal projects, you still have to do the work yourself. This is really a matter of, if you're not sure, you can talk to other people that aren't quite sure, or in particular, if you really know what you're doing, you can explain it to other people. And that act of explaining tends to solidify your thoughts and solidify your understanding. So even if you think you're, the bee's knees, you're the really top student, forming study groups is still useful because it gives you practice in explaining your ideas. And the practice of exams is me asking you to explain your ideas. And so having practiced that is helpful. And again, you're expected, realistically, I would recommend, the recommended amount is 10 hours per course per week. So I'd really be recommending 10 hours per week private study, 7 hours per week private study time. And you're going to get a lot more benefit from your private study time if you're doing it every week. So not so much averaging 5 hours, as in this allows you to do massive cramming right at the end, or right around the problem sets and around the exams. And it'll be, it's better than doing nothing, but you're going to benefit a lot more if you spread out that study time over the semester, as you are all aware, because you all have undergraduate degrees, right? You know basically how this works. What have I done? Okay, any questions? Questions, concerns, problems? This is the last of the admin-y type stuff that we're going to talk about.
Sorry, James, for the point 2, attendance lecture.
Yes.
For those, working full-time, I know it's not an excuse, but it would be unsustainable. So a workaround, just a comment, would be viewing video recordings.
If you have to miss lecture for any reason, for example, due to illness or due to other potential reasons, if you have to miss lecture, we do have lecture recordings. And as well, at the end of semester, if you want to go back and review what was done, you can go over the lecture recordings. I strongly advise not to use the lecture recordings as your, if you have the option, I strongly advise against using the lecture recordings as your primary means of learning. It is not as helpful a means of learning compared to coming to lecture. If you listen to lecture slides, you tend to be thinking about other things, you tend to be easily distracted. It's just, it has nowhere near as large a benefit as actually attending lectures. If you have to miss them, those lectures for some reason, if there's clashes or if you're ill, fine. It's something, but it's not as good. And it's significantly not as good. Thank you. Any other questions before we press forward? Yes. Ray. Yep. Not for assessment, no, not at all, not at all. Purely for internal personal benefit. But it is extremely helpful. I mean, it's extremely helpful, but it is purely for internal benefit. Okay. Excellent. We can breathe, we can move on, and we can actually talk about material for the course. And I know we're starting way back at the beginning because most of you, hopefully, don't have economics degrees. Hopefully, I mean, I imagine some probably do. Actually, as a point of interest, who has an economics degree? Oh, good. Very few, because this course is going to be super slow for those who already have economics degrees. Those who don't, this course will be nice. So what is economics? The reason why we put this slide up, the reason why we always start with this, is basically because there's a huge amount of misinformation or misunderstanding about what the study of economics actually is. People always think of economics as being about money in some way, and it's really not. Like, we use money, but we don't really care about that. It's just an aspect, it's just a thing that helps a little bit in certain circumstances, but we don't really care about money. What we care about is the management of scarce resources. And in particular, usually, but not exclusively, we care about how an economy thinks about managing its scarce resources. It is not so much about money, it's really about scarcity. I don't know why I did that. Economics is primarily a way of thinking, right? If you go through and you look at, particularly for microeconomics, and you look at microeconomics journals, right, the topics covered are hugely wide-ranging. The topics covered include consumer theory and producer theory, right? What people buy and what people sell. It also includes how we should run prisons, whether we should have positive discrimination in the workplace or in the university entries. It also covers how we should arrange kidney transfers, right? How we should give transplants. How we should arrange kidney transplants, right? The area of study is massive because mostly, especially for microeconomics, it's a way of thinking, it's a way of analyzing problems, much more so than a set of rules to remember. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be learning this way of thinking, or learning this theory. We will, for the most part, we will not, in this course at least, be discussing how we might test these theories. There is a whole branch of economics called econometrics on how to test theories, also experimental economics on how to test theories. But we're just not going to do that. It's interesting, it's important, and we're not going to do it. If you want to learn about that stuff, that's great. You can do courses in econometrics. If you want to learn most of the methods, you can learn most of the methods in your stat courses in any case. But this is what we're talking about. We're talking about the management of scarce resources. A lot of the time that's going to involve money, but not always. When we talk about macroeconomics, we're thinking, in most cases, we're thinking about the kind of questions we want, or even in micro as well. What do we produce? How do we produce it? How do we decide who gets it? And in a really broad sense, there's different ways we might do that, right? The three broad classes of ways we could establish our economy for deciding what to produce, how to produce it, and who gets it. We can talk about market economies, where we decentralize everything, right? What do we produce? Each individual person decides what they produce. How do they produce it? Each individual person decides how they produce it. Who gets it? They do some sort of decentralized method by which things move from producers to consumers, right? And this is our notion of a market economy. We can talk about command economies, right? What do we produce? What we're told. How do we produce it? The way we're told. Who gets it? Whoever gets told they get it. Most economies, in fact, virtually all economies, are some sort of level of mixed economy. Essentially, all economies are mixed to some degree. Places, as you are no doubt aware, places like America tend towards the market side. Places like the old Soviet Union tend towards the command economy sides. Historically, until sort of the 1800s or 1700s, economies were almost exclusively really heavily on the command side. The central authority kind of told you what to do and then you did it. Since then, we introduced market economies in sort of that sort of time period, 1800s, which sort of spread around the world gradually. And then we pulled back a little bit in the 1900s, and some places went back to full command. Sort of communist countries particularly went back to full command. But really, it's always on a spectrum. It's not that an economy is either market or either command. Everything is some sort of mix of those two things. For the course today, we're mostly going to talk about market economies. This course, we're mostly going to talk about market economies. We will occasionally use command economies as sort of a benchmark. The features that we normally think about for market economies, the features that make market economies work, are the first feature that we're going to use all the time, starting from next week, are freely determined prices. That is to say, prices fluctuate. It's not like the central government comes in and says, this is the price. We will generally think about freely determined prices. That said, when we look at government intervention, we will look at various price controls. We tend to think of agents having property rights, of individuals having some kind of property rights. And again, we will occasionally drop this assumption. We'll occasionally weaken this and see how we go when we weaken the assumption that we have property rights. But you need property rights to have a market economy, right? I need to be able to own things in order to be able to sell you ownership of that thing. We need freedom to trade. And again, we're going to limit this as we talk about government and we talk about trade, government intervention in week 6 and trade in week 12. We're going to weaken this, but generally speaking, if I want to buy something and you want to sell it, we're going to allow me to buy it from you, right? We're not going to limit trade in that sense. And our market economies don't have to be this, but they tend to be characterized by a mixture of government and private organizations. So we have a government organization that acts, and sometimes acts in a command kind of capacity, but sometimes just acts as an extra economic actor. We have private organizations which mostly act as private organizations, as individuals. But there's lots of stuff that goes into what makes a market economy. It's not just we can trade, right? You need prices to be you need floating prices, you need property rights. You tend to want to have a government to make everything work. Otherwise, you get some sort of anarcho-capitalist hellscape, which is not so good. This is what we're going to be talking about a little bit throughout the course. Questions, concerns at this time? It's a big room, so do wave if you have a question. Okay. This course, as I've said a couple of times now, really is unusual in that we cover microeconomics and also macroeconomics, which have now diverged pretty strongly, that they really are in some sense almost totally different disciplines at this point. Certainly in terms of the methods that they use, they are basically almost completely different disciplines. So microeconomics talks about individual decision making. And this always sounds a little bit strange because when I say individuals, I'm not necessarily talking about individual people. I'm talking about individual agents. They might be individual people, but we also might think about individual households or individual firms. So when we say firms, we mean companies, but the word used is always firms. We might talk about what individual governments do. They're still individual units. So microeconomics asks questions like, what happens if we decide to pay teachers more money? Right? What happens to teachers, what happens to other people if we pay teachers more money? Right? Or as a firm, should we buy a new machine for this factory? Or if as an individual, how much rice compared to bread should I have this week? Had a very bread-heavy week this week, actually, for various reasons. Anyway. Macroeconomics goes the other direction. Macroeconomics looks at the problems of the economy as a whole. So we look at an economy as an entire unit, as a whole. So we can ask questions like, how do we lift Sudan out of poverty? When will the central bank raise interest rates? What is our trade-off between unemployment and inflation? They're different kinds of questions. They're still similar in some ways. They're still really about scarcity, right? Ideally, we would just spend all the resources to lift Sudan out of poverty. But we have limited resources, so how can we best apply the resources we have to lift Sudan out of poverty? When will the central bank raise interest rates? Ideally, interest rates would be zero and money would be and everyone would have infinite money and there'd be no inflation. But we face scarcity. We face trade-offs. Similarly, unemployment and inflation. Ideally, unemployment would be zero. Inflation wouldn't be an issue because we would have infinite money anyway, and everything would cost zero anyway, but we have these kinds of trade-offs. This is our micro, so there's two dichotomies I want to talk about in economics. There's the macro dichotomy, and we're going to cover both sides of that. And there's the positive normative dichotomy, which I'll also talk about now, which I'll talk about quickly now. So positive economic analysis at least, is an attempt to explain what happens and why it happens. So we're thinking about what happens, we're thinking about why it happens. We really want to, in positive economics, we don't make any kind of value judgment. We never say in positive economics that something is good. We say something will happen, right? Which are quite different. And so an example might be a statement like, if we raise the minimum wage, then there'll be less people in poverty. This statement might be false. I'm not claiming the statement is true or false, but it's certainly a statement within the realm of positive economics. I'm not saying it's good to raise the minimum wage. I'm not saying it's good to have less people in poverty. I'm just saying if we do this policy, this is the outcome that we get. This is our positive economics. By contrast, normative economic analysis is an argument of what we should do. And so we always are including our value judgments in what we should do. So this would be a statement like, we should raise the minimum wage. It's certainly an economic statement, right? It's about economics, because we're talking about minimum wages, which is within our economic sphere. But it has a value judgment here. It's saying something that we should do. Even a statement like, we should raise the minimum wage because there'd be less people in poverty, right? This is a normative statement because we're making a value judgment. We're saying it's good that there's less people in poverty. Both of these concepts, both of these aspects of economics are extremely important, right? I'm not remotely saying that one is important and one is unimportant. Both of these are important. For this course in particular, but also in economics more generally, we tend to, in economics at least, we tend to focus almost exclusively on the positive questions. Academic economists, I should say, focus almost exclusively on the positive analysis. That is to say, we don't worry about the value judgments, right? As economists, we say, if we raise the minimum wage, there'll be less people in poverty. And we're happy then for other people to take that claim and to run with it and say, therefore, we should raise the minimum wage, right? The politicians can say that. That's totally fine. The political scientists can say, therefore, we should raise the minimum wage. The politicians can say that. Totally fine. The economists tend to restrict themselves to saying, if we raise the minimum wage, then there'll be less people in poverty. This is not to say that economists always do this, but typically, and particularly academic economists, will stick mostly to positive analysis. Now, that's not to say that positive analysis is, the truth or the ideal or, the best thing that there ever is. Even positive analysis is often contradictory. You will often find one economist that says if we raise the minimum wage, there'll be less people in poverty, and you'll find other economists that say if we raise the minimum wage, there'll be more people in poverty. Right? You get both. You can in positive analysis still get both outcomes, or people saying both contradictory things. So we have this. This is from the U.S. President Truman some decades ago now. Who made this statement? Give me a one-handed economists. All my economists say, on the one hand, we could do this, but on the other hand, we could do this. So he requested a one-handed economist to avoid this problem. You also have problems because of this potential for contradiction. You also get economics often being exploited as a partisan tool, so as a tool to basically push your own viewpoint. There's a link here. If you go online, you'll get a link to an ABC article on the costs and benefits of the light rail. So if you've been down the main road in Canberra, down Northbourne, main road in the north anyway, down Northbourne Avenue, you'll see that there's a light rail that's still almost finished. I think they're running test runs at the moment, but it's basically done. And so we get two quotes. The business case, which was compiled by professional services firm Ernst & Young, indicated a return of $1.20 for every dollar spent. This seems reasonable. We should do the project. The Canberra Liberals commissioned their own report into the economic viability of the project earlier this year. The report found cost of the light rail link could blow out by $300 million. Therefore, we should not do the project. Both of these claims are positive economic claims. Both of the claims that are on here are positive economic claims. They're contradictory, but they're both positive claims. The issue basically will be in terms of assumptions. And this is starting to percolate into the general media landscape, this idea of the assumptions you make matter. And that basically is the difference. The difference between these two claims are the assumptions that are being made on the modelling. And so we have this quote from Joan Robson, who's a famous British economist. The purpose of studying economics is not to acquire a set of ready-made answers to economic questions, but to learn how to avoid being deceived by economists. So as most of you will not be economists, I'm hoping that at the end of this course, you will have enough tools available to avoid being deceived by people like me. Okay, questions, comments, concerns? Do wave if you have anything again. Okay, so economics, as I said, is about scarcity and choice. We all face scarce resources, and yet we all want everything. Right? A typical assumption here is more is better. There are limitations on this, I'm aware, but basically more is better. But we face scarcity. We have a scarce amount of stuff that we have and can use, but we want everything. And so we're going to have to, at some level, we're going to have to make choices or make trade-offs. And as I say, there are lots of different types of scarce resources. Money is one, which we will talk about, but there's lots of scarce resources. Perhaps the most obvious other scarce resource other than money is time. Time is notably scarce. The fact that time is scarce means we have to make choices, right? This says 1 hour, it should really be 2 hours. You have 2 hours to spend on Thursday morning between 10 a.m. and 12 p.m., right? Do you go to lecture or do you stay in bed asleep, right? You only have those 2 hours. You can only spend those 2 hours once, and you've got to make a decision which way you go. I would recommend going to lecture, but you might not do that. You only have one Chinese New Year this year. Did you spend it with family, without family? Do you not follow Chinese New Year, right? But you only get one opportunity, right? There's a scarce resource in terms of time here of what you do over Chinese New Year this year, what you did over Chinese New Year this year, right? A TV writer is time constrained. Do they make one scripted show or make 5 reality shows? It takes 5 times as long, I'm making up numbers, 5 times as long to make a scripted show. Yeah, the scripted show is better, but I could make 5 reality shows in the time it takes to make one scripted show. And 5 reality shows is going to make a lot more money than one scripted show. So I'm going to do that. Yeah? Because we're scarce on time. Ideally, we would make scripted shows, but if it takes that much extra time to make them, then maybe it's not the best choice. As I say, money is obviously a scarce resource. We're forced to make choices. If you buy a pie, then you can't afford a sausage roll. If you buy a university education, then you can't afford a lavish lifestyle. This is a typical one. If a firm buys capital, right, buys new machines, that means it's not buying labor. It means it's not hiring more workers, because it has a limited pool of money with which to spend on expanding operations, and it either expands it by buying capital, or for every unit that it buys of capital, that's a unit it could have bought of labor, but doesn't anymore. So money is also going to be an obvious scarce resource here. But lots of things are scarce. It's not just time and money. Right? If you go for a run in the morning, then you'll be tired at work or uni that day. Why? Because your amount of energy you have that day is in some sense, a scarce resource. Right? You have a certain amount of energy you have in the day. If you go for a run in the morning, then you're going to be tired. So you're making a choice, you're making a trade-off between what to do. Right? If the central bank has to make a trade-off between inflation and unemployment, if we lower, as we'll see in weeks in the second half of the semester, if the central bank lowers inflation, then typically unemployment will increase. If the central bank acts to lower inflation, typically unemployment will increase. You have there's obviously a trade-off. The scarcity is a bit hard to see here. The scarcity is you have a certain amount of inflation plus unemployment to work with as a central bank. If you eat a pie for lunch, then you can't eat a sausage roll. The money doesn't really matter. You might have a pie and have a sausage roll. You eat the pie. Well, you can't also then eat the sausage roll because you're full, right? You've had lunch. You only get to have lunch once that day. You have a scarcity of the number of lunches you could have that day. On the larger scale, questions like how much should we do to minimize the effect of climate change? Right? We have scarce resources, but climate change is going to cause problems, so how much of our scarce resources should we apply to minimize the effects of climate change? any questions at this time? Questions, concerns? Now's a good time. Okay, sure. When we're thinking about scarcity and we're thinking particularly about trade-offs, so scarcity means having more of one thing you want, means having less of some other thing that you want. This is what scarcity is. In particular, you're forced to give up something that you want. You're forced to make a trade-off. The key concept in sort of most of economics is the idea of opportunity cost, which is to say the opportunity cost of some good is the value of the next best thing you could have got instead of getting the thing that you did, right? I chose to have a pie for lunch. The thing I didn't get to have is I didn't get to have a sausage roll, which would have been my next best option, right? I chose to have bread. I chose to have a sandwich for lunch today. That means I will choose to have a sandwich for lunch today. That means I will choose not to have rice, right? The next best alternative foregone. A key thing to note here, and the opportunity cost is essential for basically how you make choices. I get to how to make choices in a moment. Yes, good. The idea of opportunity cost is essential for how to make choices. Something that's very, very important and very key and really just misused so often is that opportunity cost is only the value of the best alternative, the next best alternative. It is explicitly not the value of all alternatives. Again, in the media particularly, you see these problems all the time. In your finance work, you're going to see this in terms of, I invest in portfolio X, but I could have invested in portfolio Y, or Z, or A, or B. There's so many other options, and they're all good, right? It doesn't matter. All that matters is the next best alternative, right? Other things in addition to that don't really matter. Yes. So we get examples, right? I bought a banh mi for lunch. I didn't actually, but let's say I did. My opportunity cost was going to the food co-op because my next best alternative, the thing I would have done otherwise, is go to the food co-op. Suppose you bought a banh mi for lunch. What would have been your opportunity cost if you'd bought a banh mi for lunch? You can give me a hand. You bought a banh mi for lunch today. I'm informing you. You are going to buy a banh mi for lunch today. What was your opportunity cost? Yeah, sure. Yep. Just yell it out. Pardon? Hamburger. Excellent. You bought a banh mi. Your opportunity cost was a hamburger because by buying, thank you. That's great. That's all I needed. Thank you. No, that's good. By buying a banh mi, you didn't buy a hamburger, so that was your opportunity cost. It's, they're similar, I guess. Anyway, the government invests in light rail. What is the opportunity cost for the government of investing in light rail? Again, it's the next best alternative. You need to be really careful, and again, I want to really emphasize the careful part of this, which is that it's the next best alternative. So the opportunity cost of this project is, so this is a claim by a member of the Legislative Assembly, so a member of local government here. The opportunity cost regarding the light rail. The opportunity cost of this project is huge. Every dollar spent on light rail is a dollar less that the government can spend on health, education, and other essential services. There's a problem with this claim. I think there's a problem with this claim. What's the problem with this claim? Hands up. What's the problem with this claim? You can tell me. Exactly, right? The opportunity cost is not that they could spend a dollar on health, education, and other essential services. Is that they have a dollar they could have spent on one of those things, right? And only one of those things. This is the problem here. It's only the next best alternative. It's not the value of all of the other alternatives. Candace Birch, unfortunately, has an economics degree from ANU, but never mind. Okay, so when we talk about how to make choices as individuals and as firms and as individual governments, basically if the benefit of doing whatever it is that you're doing exceeds the opportunity cost, then it's a good idea to buy. Right? I bought a banh mi for lunch. My opportunity cost was going to the food co-op. The benefit I would have gotten from going to the food co-op is, let's say I would get 4 happiness, or 4 utils, as we say, from going to the food co-op. I get 5 utils for buying a banh mi for lunch. I made a good choice by going and having a banh mi because the banh mi was worth more to me than the food co-op. Right? You had a banh mi for lunch, it was worth 5 utils to you. You could have had a hamburger. Hamburger was your opportunity cost. The hamburger was worth 7 utils to you. You made the wrong choice by buying a banh mi, because you could have bought a hamburger, which would have given you more utils. So the important thing for making choices, or whether a choice is a good choice, is whether it maximizes utility, but in particular whether the benefit of that action exceeds the opportunity cost of that action. The government invests in light rail. What's the opportunity cost? Well, maybe the next best thing was investing in mental health, right? ACT has an issue with mental health at the moment. Maybe that would have been a better option. But if that was the next best option, you only compare $1 on light rail with $1 in mental health, not $1 in health and mental health and and education and other essential services. We're over time. Okay. We'll do this one last point and then we will have a quick break. Any questions though? Questions this time? Yes?
Since we are talking about individual preferences, it would change, right? So how can you say that it's the best choice on a certain basis?
Sure. Preferences change, absolutely. Different people have different preferences, absolutely, right? I bought a banh mi and it was a great choice because it was the best thing I could have done. You bought a banh mi and it was a terrible choice because a hamburger would have been better, right? Absolutely, preferences will be different between different people and we have no issue with that. Absolutely, preferences will change over time. We have no issue with that. On this particular day, banh mi was the right choice for me. Tomorrow, maybe it won't be. So absolutely, preferences change. We absolutely are very, very happy with, and we will, it is essential, in fact, that people have different preferences. So I value a banh mi at 5, but you value it only at 4, right? Totally fine.
So how does this affect the macro thing? Because ultimately, macro would be like a group as a whole, right? So when we see it at a macro level, since there's like a lot of difference in variance, how do you have a general thing?
We will talk, in the particular case, about combining individuals' preferences to make a demand curve, a market demand curve. We'll talk about it tomorrow. Next week. In the particular case on building market demand curves, it'll be something we discuss next week. In the more general case, it's actually quite difficult. Combining preferences can be very, very challenging. But in the specific instance of market demand, I value this thing at 5, you value it at 4, and building a market demand from that, it's a thing we'll do next week. Does that address your concern? Somewhat? We absolutely assume that different people, we will assume next week that different people have different preferences. And because they do. I mean, they obviously do. And so it makes sense to assume that. And the entire demand-supply framework it requires that different people have different preferences. So when I say how to make choices, I'm not suggesting that everyone's choice should be the same. This is the process by which economists think people should make choices, right? They should compare how much benefit they get from an action to their opportunity cost for that action, which is different than saying, which is different than saying this is the right action for everyone always. No? Yes? It's okay? Okay. If it's still concerning, I can have a chat with you afterwards. Otherwise, questions, concerns? Again, wave, because that was it's hard to see. Okay. So before we have a quick break, we'll talk about what is an economic model, because this has all sorts of concerns and all sorts of problems that people have with this. So an economic model is some kind of explanation of how the economy or how part of the economy works. An important component of this is that it is an abstract, simplified explanation of how the economy or part of an economy works. When we build our economic models, we're not trying to replicate an economy. We're trying to gain insight into how it works, which are quite different ideas. Right? What we tend to do is we choose what we think is most important and include that in the model. And this is really why we have lots and lots of different types of models, because for different circumstances, different things are important. When I'm thinking about the trade-off between unemployment and inflation, the fact that different people have different preferences is really not that important. When I'm thinking about how as a firm I should decide the price of my good, It's really important that different people have different preferences. It's not that important that there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So because, depending on the question that we want to ask, different things are going to be important, and so we're going to need different models for different purposes. So we choose what we think is important, we include that, we tend to ignore all the other things, or we include them only very, very peripherally. And a component of this, an implication of this is that all of our models are wrong, in the sense that none of our models are correct, but lots of our models are going to be useful. Right? Our demand-supply model isn't correct, right? We don't have purely upward-sloping demands and downward-sloping supplies, and there's a single point at which they cross, and that's bollocks, right? That's just not true. That's not how the world works. But it's useful, and it gives us really good insight into how things do work in reality. A correct model would be the issue being basically that if you had a correct model, the only way to build a correct model of the economy is to run a computer simulation with, 6 or whatever up to 7 billion different individuals that can combine in different ways. It's impossible, right? A correct model would be so complicated that we can't get any insight from it. It would just be totally pointless to us. So, because the entire course we're going to be talking about economic models, I want to think quickly about some simple non-economic models that we may have hopefully seen in the past. So again, what makes a model good is what you want to use it for. Right, we have two different here models of gravity. We have Galilean gravity in number 1 and Newtonian gravity in number 2. And so Galilean gravity says objects accelerate to the ground at 9.8 meters per second. This is a great way of doing things. If I want to know how long it'll take an object to fall from a height down to the ground, this is going to be exactly what I use. It's going to be great, it's going to work perfectly. If I want to know how long it takes the moon to orbit the Earth, this tells me virtually nothing. Right? This is totally useless to me. Right? Gravity number 2 is more accurate, right? So masses are pulled together according to this Newtonian equation here, this equation from Newton, is going to be totally useless, realistically, totally useless to me if I'm thinking about how long it takes for an object to fall from a height down to the ground. Right? I can use it to find that out, but it's really not very good at doing that. I need to know the diameter, I need to know the radius of the Earth, I need to know the mass of the Earth, I need to know this number g here, which is some very specific constant. I need to know lots of stuff, and then even at the end of the day, I then get force, which I have to work through again to work out acceleration. It's not very helpful for that. It's true, it's correct, and it's more general than gravity number 1, but it's not helpful for the kinds of specific questions that gravity 1 can answer. But it can answer more questions. So it's not that gravity 2 is better, it's that it answers a broader class of questions, but that means it answers those specific questions that gravity 1 answers less well. Right? So gravity 1 answers this group of questions really well, gravity 2 answers this group of questions, but not as well, as you'd expect. We talk about a roadmap of Canberra versus a roadmap of Australia. This one's a bit dated now because Google Maps lets you zoom in and out freely, but still. If you were to buy a roadmap of Canberra, if you wanted to drive from here to Tuggeranong, you want a roadmap of Canberra. If you want to drive from here to Tuggeranong, a roadmap of Australia is going to be of absolutely no use to you, right? Because it's not going to have the roads that you need. If you want to drive from here to Adelaide, the roadmap of Canberra, or to Sydney, the roadmap of Canberra is going to be useless. But the roadmap of Australia is going to be really quite handy. So what you're wanting to use it for will depend on which model is better. Roadmaps are models of the roads. Here. The final one I talk about is the model aeroplane, because we have fun things. So we can talk about different,
Just a minor correction there. Acceleration is 9.8 meters per second squared.
Oh, sure, yes. You're right, it is, yes. Okay, so we think about models for aeroplanes. So we have different models that we might have for an aeroplane and how an aeroplane works. And so we're going to have 3 models. We're going to have this nice blueprint of the 1903 Wright brothers plane. We have, ideally this would be a little model, but I don't have one. So we're going to pretend that this picture is actually a nice little 3D model that I can hold in my hand. And I have my little model aeroplane. all of these models are good for different purposes. If I wanted to build a model aeroplane, then I'm going to want this. This is going to be the most useful model for how to actually build an aeroplane. If I want to know what a modern aeroplane looks like, then I really want this. Again, pretending it's an actual physical object. It's going to be the best indication of what an aeroplane actually looks like. If I want to know what an aeroplane does and have some idea of how it works, then I'm going to want this little fellow. Everyone's got their eyes, everyone's looking. If you're not looking and you get hit in the face, I do apologize. It's behind there. You see it flies a little bit. It doesn't fly great, but it flies okay. So we can have different models for different purposes, depending on what we want to do. None of them are better than the other. They're all just different. I do want to do this. Where am I? Where can I stop? Okay. I'm going to push forward a tiny bit, but any questions at this time? Questions, concerns at this time? Yes? Yep. Exactly. Because we compare, so the opportunity cost is the benefit of the next best action. Yeah, is the benefit you gain from the next best action. Yes. Questions, concerns? I want to press on because there's a good spot to stop in just a second. Okay, so I want to talk very, very quickly about testing economic models, but again, only very quickly. Part of the story here is that economic models, all economic models tell as-if stories. That is to say, we don't really think that people behave according to people think the way that we say they think in our models. We don't really think that people in finance models, we don't really think that normal people perform Black-Scholes in their head, right? But they maybe behave as if they do these things. In economics, we don't really assume that people do full utility maximization problems and solve complicated expressions, but we think that they behave as if they do these things. So all of our models are always going to be at these as-if stories. This is a nice way of thinking about this problem. It's not necessarily exactly what's going on in people's heads. I want to talk quickly about the fact that controlled experiments in economics tend to be extraordinarily difficult. So for testing most models, if you go to physics and you want to test a model, you take your model, or biology is actually easier for this. You're in medicine and you're trying to test whether a drug works. What do? You run a controlled trial. You get a bunch of people which you give the drug to, you get a bunch of people you don't give the drug to, and you see what the difference is between them. In economics, or in macroeconomics particularly, it's really hard to do that. In microeconomics, you can do it a little bit, but in macro, it's really hard to do that. We can't take a group, if we want to look at whether right now in Australia, increasing the interest rate will reduce unemployment, we can't take a bunch of Australias and increase the interest rate in them, and take another bunch of Australias and not increase the interest rate in those, and see what happens to unemployment in each case, right? Because we only have one Australia to work with. So controlled experiments tend to be outside what we can do, particularly in macro, though in micro it's becoming more common. What this means is that it can be really, really hard to separate correlation and causation. I mean, in some cases, really hard. Maybe it's the case that increasing interest rates will lower unemployment, but maybe it won't. Maybe it just happens to be the case that in the past, on those occasions when we've increased on interest rates, we've also seen lower unemployment, or vice versa. Maybe, right? It's hard to separate when things happen to coincide versus when one is causing the other. Now again, I'm going to talk about this relatively briefly because we're not going to talk about econometrics or experimental economics in this course. It's important to know that they're done and that they are important, and that I encourage you, if you want, there are courses you can do on econometrics, and they're great. Do have a look. A lot of the stuff will be very similar to what you're doing in some of your stats courses, but this is all fine. So econometrics is the study of usually existing economic data. So we take our economic data and we throw big piles of maths at it and we see what we can get out of it. And this allows us to test a huge range of models. Right? Macroeconomic models, lots of microeconomic models, right? We can look at the effect of So there's a few people actually at the moment in our school at the moment who are looking at the effect of birth order on outcomes. So whether being the firstborn or the secondborn or the thirdborn in your family, what effect that has on things like educational attainment or on eventual income. And there's different models, and we can use econometrics to test that. But again, we have problems. We have difficulty separating correlation and causation. In the birth order example, maybe being the firstborn is really helpful, right? Maybe being firstborn is terrible. Maybe being firstborn means you have really bad outcomes. Maybe being second or thirdborn maybe being firstborn has great outcomes. In a place like Australia, particularly, maybe being second or thirdborn means that your family isn't that wealthy to begin with, because typically in places like Australia, there's a correlation between number of children and income level. So maybe you have lots of children. That means that your family was just not that well off anyway. So maybe the fact that you're a fourthborn is not the problem. Maybe it's that fourthborns tend to be born to relatively poor parents. And so there's a correlation between being the fourthborn and having low educational attainment, but it's not caused by being the fourthborn child. It's just caused by the fact that if you're a fourthborn child, you tend to be born to families that are not that well off and therefore tend to do worse. So it's difficult, it can be difficult in econometrics to separate correlation and causation. The new field that's opening up, that's really been opening up in the last 10 years or so, is experimental economics. So here is we create and study economic data. So this really only applies mostly to microeconomic models, mostly, not exclusively, but mostly to microeconomic models. Lots of behavioral economics falls into this, lots of decision theory falls into this. We basically take people, we put them in a little room, and we do experiments on them. We get them to perform various tasks, and we see what they do. And this is great. This is really handy because here we can actually perform some controlled experiments. We can take some people and we can prime them to do some particular action and see what they do, take other people and not prime them towards some particular action and see what they do. So it's a lot easier to separate correlation and causation because we can build these kinds of controlled experiments in experimental economics. The problem is we really have a very narrow range of models that we can test. We can't test for birth order effects, right, in these kind of experimental economics because we can't make a controlled experiment on birth order, right? We can't test most macro models in these kinds of frameworks. So it's nice, it's lovely, it's a new growing field, and it has lots of benefits, but it also means you can't do as much as you can with econometrics. Okay, one last slide and then we have a break. One last slide, I promise, then we have a break. In our models, we're really late, that's okay. In our models, there's going to be a couple of different background assumptions that we're almost never going to question. In all of our economic models for the next semester, more is better than less, right? We like to have more of things. If I offer you a banana or 2 bananas, you want 2 bananas every time. More is better than less. This one looks a bit silly, and it's designed to look a bit silly, which is people are motivated by motives, which is to say if you encourage someone to do something, then they're going to be encouraged to do that thing. If you reduce prices, people are going to be more likely to buy that thing. So we want people to be motivated by motives. It keeps things easy. The tricky one is this nice little Latin phrase called ceteris paribus, which means all else equal. This is going to be super important in all of what we call comparative statics, but it's also in all of our economic analysis. When we're thinking about what happens to our model, when we think about what happens when we change part of our model, we assume everything else is held equal. If I'm thinking about your trade-off between bread and rice, and I change the price of rice, I hold everything else equal. I don't also change the price of bread. I don't also change my agent's preferences. I just look at what happens if I increase the price of rice. Right? I don't do anything else. So as background assumption, we're always going to be assuming not so much in our models, but in our analysis of our models, that when we change one thing, that's the only thing that changes. Right? It's silly to say the price of rice increases, therefore this, and maybe also the price of bread increases because that'll be interesting and we'll see what happens. No, we change one thing and we see what happens. Or maybe we change 2 things, but we leave everything else the same, right? We leave everything else equal in all of our analyses. Now we will have a quick break. Any questions though? Questions, concerns? Yes. Yep. Oh God, no, no. So in an assessment, in any kind of assessment, in any kind of exam or the problem sets, unless you're breaking these, which you don't, then they hold, and you assume they hold. These are really, really, really background assumptions. I put them up because I want to make it clear that that they do exist, that we are having these background assumptions. You can question these, but unless you're questioning them, then we just hold them to be true. Okay, we'll have a quick break where we'll reconvene at 1:15. If you have any questions, you can come and see me quickly now, but only for 5 minutes or so. So we'll have a quick break, quick breather, and we'll reconvene at 1:15. Thanks. Seriously? Ugh. That should be P naught, shouldn't it? Fuck. Does this work? All right, welcome back, everyone. Cool, welcome back, everyone. We will now have a brief mathematical interlude. Despite the fact that most of you guys are doing finance courses or accounting courses or business courses, business programs, this course is going to be pretty light on the mathematics, particularly pretty light on assumptions on what you know about mathematics. So when we need anything, I'm going to talk about it, but we're not going to need much more throughout the entire course, with one exception. We're not going to need much more than what I'm going to talk about right now. We really don't need too much for this course. So we're going to have a brief mathematical interlude. I mostly want to cover things, and again, for most of you, this will be super straight, or for many of you at least, this will be super straightforward, but I really want to cover it to make sure that everyone's on the same page. So we talk first of all about fundamental algebra. Yeah. So we talk about the equal sign, and we talk about variables versus coefficients. Because my experience at least has been that people really struggle with this. They struggle with the equal sign is probably the biggest thing that people struggle with at a really basic level, and they struggle with it for a really good reason, which is that the equal sign can mean lots and lots of different things depending on the different circumstances you're in. And that's deeply unfortunate, but it is true. So when I write this equation here, or when I write, let's write an even simpler equation. Let's write something like y equals 4x plus 2. The equal sign here is doing a particular thing. Better or worse? Better? Worse. Cool. Found the midpoint. The equal sign here is doing a particular thing. The equal sign here is declaring a relationship. The equal sign here is declaring a relationship between the value of y, between lots of different potential values of y, and lots of different potential values of x. Here, the equal sign is establishing a relationship, which I think I've spelt wrong, but that's okay. It's establishing a relationship between x and y, right? We're not really establishing equality in some sense, right? If I write y equals 7, the equal sign is doing a different sort of thing here, right? Here, the equal sign is really establishing equality. Here, we're really establishing equality in some more fundamental sense. And there's a distinction here. I'm not going to go too much into this because I'm hoping that, that generally speaking, we're aware of the distinctions here. But I'm just sort of emphasizing there is a distinction, and you need to be aware of this at least a little bit. Sometimes we're going to be looking at relationships, sometimes we're going to be looking at actual values. When I say y naught equals 7, or y equals 7, I'm saying this y, this thing is equal to 7, right? This is no longer a variable. When I'm saying y equals 4x plus 2, then I'm establishing a relationship between these two objects, and they operate differently. In the same vein, I can talk about variables as opposed to coefficients. Most of the time, whenever we're working in a general setting, we want to make this distinction between variables, which are letters that vary their value, versus coefficients, which are letters that have some fixed but unknown value. So the most typical example, let's say you do mx plus b actually. It's y equals mx plus b. This is our standard form for our linear equation. And based on context, we hopefully are aware that this has two variables and two coefficients. What are the coefficients in this equation? M and B. M and B are our coefficients. Excellent. These are our coefficients. And obviously, by processes of elimination, y and x are variables. These objects are treated differently in our models. They're treated differently in how we should think about them. Coefficients, again, we want to think of coefficients as being values. We don't know what they are, but they're just standing in for some specific value, right? It makes sense here to say, for example, m is 7. It doesn't make sense here to say, for example, y is 6, right? That doesn't have the same meaning because m and b are coefficients, y and x are variables. If I do a more in-depth example, I can talk about, because we're going to, I can talk about these sort of price-quantity trade-offs. What are my, you can see hopefully fairly readily, if this is a price-quantity trade-off or a price-quantity graph, what would be the coefficients in this expression here? What are the coefficients in this one here? It's a lot of mumbling. Who reckons P is a coefficient? A. Q. Quantity. P naught. It's interesting. Who has no idea what the distinction is between coefficients and variables? Who feels like they've mastered it but didn't put their hand up for some other reason? No one? Those who put their hands up were entirely right. We're thinking about a price-quantity trade-off, and so our variables are price and quantity. And our coefficients are going to be the other objects. They're going to be other things that give us the structure of the model, if you like, the structure of the market, typically. So I want to make this distinction. The equal sign has lots of different meanings. The two main ones are going to be either forming a relationship between two objects or saying that something is literally equal to something else. And I want to make the distinction between variables and coefficients. And then we can talk about graphing, because economists use graphs all the time. You've hopefully seen a demand and supply graph somewhere at some stage in your life, but you may not have, that's okay. But hopefully you will have seen a demand and supply graph. For economists tend to like graphs because as a method of showing trade-offs, which is what economics is all about, graphs are really, really useful, particularly graphs of two variables. In a lot of economic questions, we have more than two things we're trading off between. When you have more than two things, graphs start to become a real problem and start to become not very helpful, because you can draw a two-dimensional graph really easily on a piece of paper. Drawing a three-dimensional graph on a two-dimensional piece of paper, it's kind of hard. Drawing four-dimensional and five-dimensional and 100-dimensional graphs, it's not great, right? Our minds aren't really built for that. Our minds are built for three-dimensional things because that's the world we live in. But for economists, we tend to like graphs. And we use graphs to show the relationship between different things, right? So I can draw a graph. The most common one we're going to use lots and lots throughout this course is this graph that compares quantity to price. I'll even write them out. This one time I'm going to write them out. That compares quantity to price. and we have some kind of relationship between quantity and price. So perhaps the most common relationship between quantity and price would be something like demand, right? When the price is $7, I'm going to buy 2 units of the good, right? So when the price is 7, I buy 2 units of the good, and so this point here is going to lie on my graph of demand. When the price is $5, I'm going to buy, let's say I want to say a bit more than that, let's say 6 units of the good. I'm going to buy 6 units of the good. So this point here is going to lie on my graph. And there's going to be some, and for every different possible value of price, there's some amount of quantity, right? And that relationship could be really complicated. That relationship between the price of the good and the amount of the good that I buy might be really complicated. We're typically going to use straight lines to keep things easy, but it might be really complicated in principle. So maybe for this particular market, I don't have a good market for this. Market for bread, since that's apparently what I'm using today. In the market for bread, this is going to be my demand line or demand curve, demand for James. This is my demand curve, and it says at different prices how many of the good I choose to purchase, right? I look at my curve and I say, well, given this is my curve, when the price is $2, how many units do I buy? I buy 7 units of the good. Right? This is how these graphs work. You can go the other direction as well for price-quantity trade-offs. For the demand curve, we tend to think of this as being backwards compared to what you normally think of. We tend to think of, at this price, this is the amount that I buy. You can think of it the other way. Given that you saw me walking out of the shop with 7 loaves of bread, that means they must have been $2 each. Right? They must have been $2 each because that's what my demand curve says. My demand curve says if I have 7 loaves of bread, when do I do that? When the price is $2 per loaf. So we can use these graphs to develop reasonably nice ways of visualizing the relationship between two variables. And as I say, this is really helpful because otherwise we have to pore through tons and tons of algebra, and a lot of the time you can get the same insights from using a really simple graph as you can either get the same insights by using a really simple graph and shifting a curve a little tiny bit, as you can from doing a huge pile of algebra, right? And you get the same insights. Different results, but you get the same insights into what's going on just by doing this. We will mostly use graphs. We will occasionally use things like occasionally use equations. If we're using equations for lines, we're only going to be using things that are nice and linear and clean. So again, we're thinking about the market for bread. Quantity, price. But let's go the other direction, and we're thinking about a store. You know, I am a manager at Woolies, and I'm deciding how many loaves of bread I'm going to sell. I'm going to put up for sale today. Head office comes to me and says, well, the price is going to be $4. And I'm thinking as Woolies, I'm thinking, if at $4 a loaf, that's actually a huge amount, isn't it? At $2 a loaf, that's not that high. I don't think it's really worth me selling all that many loaves of bread at $2 a loaf. So I'm going to sell 1,000 loaves of bread at $2 per loaf. Seems reasonable. Head office comes to me and says, today we're doing a new marketing thing. Today we're selling loaves at $3 per loaf. At $3 per loaf. And I go, oh yeah, that's a lot better. At $3 per loaf, I can really make bank on every loaf that I sell. So I'm going to try and sell, I'm going to want to sell 2,000 loaves of bread instead. Right. Head office comes to me and says, you have to sell bread at $1 per loaf, right? You have no choice. Today is sale day, and we've done a national campaign. On Thursday, the 28th of February, we're selling loaves of bread at $1 per loaf. And you go, well, that's terrible. If I sell loaves at $1, I lose money on every loaf that I sell. This is just an awful idea. So I'm going to just not sell any. I'm going to not offer any loaves of bread for sale, and that will be completely fine. And I'm going to offer no loaves of bread for sale. And we get a nice curve, and this is what we're going to end up calling the supply curve in week 3. This is our supply curve. It's how much we as the supplier of loaves of bread want to try to sell on the market. And we can talk about the equation of this line. So occasionally we want to do this by graphs, occasionally we want to do it by equations, and we want to try and move between those relatively easily. So when I think about the equation of this line, I typically put this in terms of price, but I can do either way. So the supply, we would say that the supply curve, the curve that we're graphing is the supply curve, and the equation for this supply curve, can anyone tell me what the equation for the supply curve is? Just looking at it quickly. Otherwise I have to work it out. That looks right. Thank you. Excellent. Exactly. So we go through and we work through this, and we get that it's Q divided by 1,000 plus 1. That's the price that we want to charge in our market. Right? If I want to sell Q, well, given that I want to sell Q, this is the price I want to charge. We also sometimes will express this in the other direction. We can express this as the quantity that I sell. And I think for supply, putting it in terms of quantity that I sell makes in some sense a bit more sense. So we can say that the quantity I sell is going to be 1,000p minus 1,000. 1,000p minus 1,000. If I want to think about how many loaves of bread I'm going to sell at different prices, this is the equation that tells me how many loaves of bread I sell at different prices. This is the equation that tells me if I want to sell a quantity Q, this is the price I have to charge to do that. And again, they're the same equation. They're representing the same relationship, and different ones of them are going to be useful at different times. And I'm not going, without going through how to do this, if you're not aware of how to move from the graph to the equation to the other equation, there's lots of online sources that can go through this. I'm saying that you need to know it, but there's lots of online sources that can work you through these things. This is all about equations of a line. Any questions though at this time? Questions, concerns? Very, very important for us is going to be the intercepts are going to be important, but not super important. The slopes of these lines are going to be super important. Slopes are going to be related to elasticities, which we'll talk about hopefully next week. But in any case, the slope of these lines are going to be super important. This line is obviously upward sloping. If I want to think about what the slope of this line is, the slope of this line is this coefficient here. This number here is the slope of this line. More generally, in a sort of generic slope problem, on paper. In a generic problem with slope, right? I want the slope of this line. I do rise over run. I know this is super simple, but it's called rise over run. This is the change in the vertical component divided by the change in the horizontal component. So to go from here to here, right, the slope of this line segment, let's make up some numbers, 4, 6, 2, 4. The slope of this line here is going to be the change in y, so that's 4 minus 2, right, the change here, over the change here, which is also 6 minus 4. Did this poorly, that's okay. And so we get the slope of this line is slope 1. Please note, in a lot of our economics, our slopes are going to be things like 1,000th or 1,000, right? Are going to be typical amounts for slope. which is part of why we use elasticity instead. So typically what you're going to see is things more like this is 4,000, this is 6,000, right? It's going to be more typical. And so then this is 4 minus 2 over 6,000 minus 4,000. And so the slope is 1,000th rather than 1. It's not at all uncommon. The graphs look the same, but the slopes are very different. So you need to be a little bit careful here. And again, this is why, as we'll talk about next week, why we talk about, hopefully next week, why we talk about elasticity is more often than slope. Intercepts are not that important. You need to know what they are, and they're useful for building equations of line, but this here is what we would call the y-intercept, because it's the point where we hit what's called the y-axis. We talk about the x-axis as the horizontal axis, the y-axis is the vertical axis. This is the y-intercept. We may potentially have an x-intercept. Right, if I have a different line, or if I had this line instead, then this point here is going to be the x-intercept. In most economic applications, our graphs tend to be exclusively in this top right quadrant, because most of the time it doesn't make sense to talk about a person consuming minus 2 apples. I don't know what it means for me to eat minus 2 apples in a day. Most of the time prices are going to be positive, or at least non-negative, because it seems really sick, because if the price is minus $1 per apple, since more is better, I can get $1 and an apple. I'm just going to buy infinite amounts of apples and have infinite dollars and infinite apples. And so we tend not to have negative prices either. So most of our graphs are going to be relationships between two variables. We will occasionally, particularly in macro, we'll talk about time series graphs a lot more, which are still giving this relationship between two variables, but the nature of that relationship is a bit different. So when we're thinking about time series graphs, we're thinking about something like time, which is always on the x-axis, and we're trying to track how something has changed over time. So we're trying to track, let's say, in macro, something like GDP as time varies for a particular country. And so maybe it's increasing and everyone's happy, but then there's a recession, but then we come back from the recession, but then there's a war, which we never quite recover from, and then we start to open up our economy and everything's going beautifully, and there's a little recession, but that's okay. Maybe GDP looks like this. I feel like Russian GDP. No, Russian never really recovered, did they? There are economies that look like this. The Hungarian economy probably will look quite similar to this. You'll have the period, the Soviet period, you'll have the post-Soviet period, and then you'll have the modern period. So this might be what GDP looks like. And the nature of this relationship is a little bit different. Right? When we're talking about the relationship between price and quantity, we really are thinking about sort of going either way. We could say, at this price, this is the quantity. At this quantity, this is the price. With time GDP or time whatever, we're really not thinking that. We're saying, at this time, this is the GDP of the country. At this time, this is the exchange rate of the country. It's just a difference in emphasis and interpretation. Okay, questions? Any questions on our brief mathematical interlude? Again, this is mostly you're expected to know this stuff, or you need to know this stuff. So if you don't, you can come to us in help desk time or in tutorials, or you can have a look on, and you can also have a look online where there's lots of material to learn this kind of stuff. This course will not require calculus of any kind. It may be helpful to understand certain concepts, but it will not at all be required. Questions, concerns? Okay, so just to finish up, I'm going to talk quickly about gains from trade, because in economics we care a lot about trade as well. So you'll recall our background assumption. This is why we make these background assumptions, that people are motivated by motives, which is to say if someone chooses to do something, it's because they wanted to do it. No one's going to choose to do something that they don't want to do, because people are motivated by motives. Right? So the impact of this is that any trade, freely agreed to, necessarily makes both parties better off. At least in the short run. There's long-run issues, all that kind of stuff, but certainly in the short run, or if our people are fully rational, any trade freely agreed to between two people has to make both of them better off. Because I'm not going to agree to a trade that makes me worse off. You're not going to agree to a trade that makes you worse off. Right? So trades that are made make us better off. Potential trades that are not made don't get made because people don't get made better off by them. And we can talk about we will talk very quickly about two broad classes. I'm trying to think what I've got left. Okay. We'll finish a bit early today, I think. Two very, very broad classes of trade. The first ways we can get gains from trade, the first is consumers and the second is producers. So consumers can get gains from trade. We'll just go through the examples. So Adam has 2 pairs of pants, Maria has 2 shirts. Can they trade to become better off? Who reckons Adam and Maria can trade to become better off? No one? Adam's sitting there with his 2 pairs of pants. Maria's sitting there with her 2 shirts. Who reckons they can trade to become better off? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Not a lot. A worryingly small number of people do not feel this is a good. There's trades made here. I would argue that there's definitely good trades to be made here. Right? Adam has 2 pairs of pants, but no shirts. Adam is stuffed because he only has pants. Maria has 2 shirts, but no pants. Maria is stuffed because she only has shirts and doesn't have pants. If they trade, then they both have something to wear. They can both dress themselves fully. And so we get gains from trade. Both people become better off if Adam sells a pair of pants and Maria sells a shirt in order to buy the alternative. So they trade. Similarly, Qingyin has 3 apples for his lunch and Hassan has 3 bananas. Qingyin likes bananas more than apples. Hassan likes apples more than bananas. Can they trade to become... It's a question. I'll come to it a second. Can they trade to become better off? Who feels that... So currently we have Qingyin over here, and we have Hassan over here. Hassan has 3 bananas. Qingyin has 3 apples. Hassan has 3 bananas. Can they trade to become better off? Who reckons they can trade to become better off? Everyone. Excellent. Now, there's multiple different trades that they could make to become better off. One of them is the best trade. I haven't given you enough information yet to be able to determine which is the best trade. But they definitely can trade and become better off. Right? In particular, they could end up with Qingyin has 2 apples and 1 banana, and Hassan has 1 apple and 2 bananas. Right? This is option A, let's call it, option B. Option B is better than option A, right? Because they've traded in such a way that they've both got a piece of fruit that they prefer. They could go to option C, right? Option C is 1 apple, 2 bananas, 2 apples, 1 banana. Option C is better again for both people. Option C is definitely a trade you would make over option A. I do want to talk about option D quickly because I think it's useful and important. We have option D, which is we trade completely. We swap all of our fruit. Qingyin ends up only with bananas, Hassan ends up only with apples. I feel, without making any additional assumptions, there's a couple of things that are pretty clearly the case. It's pretty clearly the case that A is better for both people than B. It's pretty clearly the case that B is better than A. Right? B is a better option than A. We would prefer, as a group, both people would prefer B to where they are in B to where they are in A. Both people would prefer where they are in C to where they are in A. Both people would prefer where they are in D to where they are in A, because compared to A, they have more of the thing that they want. This seems reasonable. I think it's quite reasonable to say that C is better than D. Sorry, is better than B. Oh, doing this badly. I think it's quite reasonable to say that C is better than B, because the only difference between C and B is we still get our nice variety, but now we just get more of the thing that we like in C compared to in B. I do want to argue that it's really unclear what the relationship is between C and D, because while people tend to like, and this is a very general claim which we won't cover too much in this course, but if you go any deeper in economics or if you want to apply the ideas in a real-world setting. People like variety as well. So people tend to like the things that they like, and they tend to also like variety. I prefer bananas a lot more to apples. I like bananas a lot more than apples. This is a personal thing. I personally like bananas a lot more than I like apples. If I was buying my fruit when I'm buying my fruit for the week, I buy a mixture of bananas and apples. I buy mostly bananas, but I buy some apples as well. Because while I prefer bananas, I also like to have variety. So you want to be a little bit careful. It's not just for real-world applications. People are not going to specialize their consumption completely. This is not the case for production. Production is different. But for real-world consumption, people are not going to specialize completely. They will tend to prefer variety within their own preferences. But certainly, in any case, there's definitely trades that are available that make people better off. And something I want to really emphasize here is when we've made these trades, it's not that we're getting more stuff. Right? The improvement in welfare here is not being caused by the world having more things. It's being caused purely by the things that already exist being distributed more effectively, going to those people that have better welfare for them. So sometimes we're going to see gains from trade because we see increases in the amount of stuff that's made. Sometimes we're going to see gains from trade purely because we distribute things in a more appropriate or in a better way that causes increases in welfare in any case. Any question? Question? There are no costs here, or rather there are no monetary costs or no anything like this. I'm sitting in Chinyan and Hassan are sitting in a room, sitting next to each other. Chinyan's bought 3 apples for lunch. Hassan's bought 3 bananas for lunch. Can they chat amongst themselves and trade in order to create improvement? And the answer is yes. Yeah. But yes, so certainly costs matter as well. Obviously, yes. Obviously, yes, it is the case that this is a sort of a prior question, right? Why has Chinyan ended up with 3 apples and Hassan's ended up with 3 bananas when they don't like those? But we're ignoring those kinds of cost issues for this particular example. Questions? Yes? Not necessarily, because more is better, but variety is also good. So more is better the more is better assumption, the more is better background assumption, says more money is better, more bananas are better, more apples are better. It doesn't say anything about if I can get more apples, but it costs me bananas, which of those options is better. So if Chinyan could go and just take all the bananas and also have all the apples, that's the best option for him. But Hassan's not going to agree to a trade that says Chinyan gets all of everything and Hassan gets nothing. So when we make trades, we need both parties to become at least weakly better off. Yes, not so much price. I don't want to say price, but it is entirely the better off here means they perceive themselves to have increased welfare. Absolutely, it's not an objective. It's a purely subjective thing. How much you value whatever it is that you're getting, and I guess since there are lots of finance people, we should make that as a major distinction between economics and finance. In finance, lots of things have objective value. In finance, you have some portfolio, and it's worth what it's worth. In economics, that's really not the case for almost anything that we're interested in. When we're thinking about, and this is your point from earlier, when we're thinking about apples or bananas, or we're thinking about how many hours of labor you want to supply to your workplace, how much your time is worth to you, how much my time is worth to me, will be different than how much your time is worth to you. And so all of these kinds of valuations are all subjective. Prices will tend to be objective. Prices will tend to be, there's a market and the price is $5, and that's just what it is. But certainly the valuations are all going to be subjective. It's all going to be internal, yes, which is very different from my understanding of most of finance. Is that fair? Cool. Yep. It's a Pareto improvement. Yes, so a trade, we'll talk, I don't know, we'll talk about it. A trade, certainly, any trade is necessarily a Pareto improvement. Because if it's not a Pareto improvement, then you wouldn't agree to it. If I come to you and I offer you some trade that makes you worse off, which is to say a trade that's not a Pareto improvement, you're going to say no, right? I will sell you this, what do I have in pocket? I will sell you this pen for $200, right? Your answer is no, right? You're not going to pay me $200 for this pen, because that would be ridiculous. So yes, every trade has to be a Pareto improvement if you want to use that sort of terminology. Okay, I tried to emphasize with these kinds of trades that the gains from welfare are because of allocation, not because of production. Of course, you can also have circumstances where gains from trade are because of changes in amount produced. So we're hosting a dinner where we want our guests to have many food options, right? And so we have two choices of how to make this happen. We can either do potluck. Potluck is where you invite people around and you say, bring a dish and we'll all share it, right? Bring enough food to feed yourself and a bit more, and everyone will have what everyone brought, and it'll be lovely. The other option is to say to everyone, you know what, everyone, bring your dishes, make a various selection for yourself, and you will have your various selection, and you will get what you get. You will get what you bring. I want to argue that quite clearly the potluck option here is better. It is better to have everyone bring a plate and share it, have everyone bring one plate and then share it, or one dish and you share it, rather than everyone brings their own collection of stuff. And the question is, why is it obviously better? Right? In either case, the outcome in terms of what you get to eat is exactly the same. Right? It's still the case that you get to have a variety of food. It's just whether you made one thing and then everyone has some of it, or you made a small portion of all the different things. And so we want to make an argument for why potluck is better, and because we're economists, or because we will be economists, or because we are doing an economics course at least, we're going to make a model, because economists like models. So we're going to make a model. So we're going to say that there are 2 people at our dinner party. Why have I chosen to only have 2 people? It's not reasonable. Certainly a dinner party will have more than 2 people in it. So in my model, why are there only 2? Perfect. It makes the model easier to explain. It makes the model easier to analyze. I don't need more than 2. All the insights I'm going to gain, I gain with 2 people. So why would I make things more complicated by having more people? I want to keep things as simple as I possibly can, and no simpler. I don't want to have one person, because if I only have one person within a party, I lose all the analysis. If I have more than 2 people, I don't gain any extra insight. So I want things to be as simple as possible, but no simpler. Say for the same reason, everyone can make 2 dishes. They can make a curry dish or a pasta dish. We only have 2 because that gives us all the insight that we need already. To make things easy, we make assumptions. If a person makes a single dish, they make 3 servings. If a person makes both dishes, they make 1 serving of each dish, because it takes time, because it's easier to scale up production of pasta or curry than it is to make separate things. And so we can talk about this discussion, but in a nice little table form. So we have Paul and Tiara. They can either make both. If they make both, they each make 1. Or Paul can exclusively make curry, in which case he gets 3 curries and no pastas. Paul can exclusively make pasta, in which case he